Today we're talking to Ted Troller and will be for a few times, and you can see where we're located on the ranch here. So, Ted, you've got some things you want to talk about. Go for it.
Well, again, as Bob says, I'm not a young kid anymore. Been here for 66, going on 60. Well, came here in 1953, so had a little bit of history and met a lot of old timers, and a lot of those just kind of disappeared. But we also have to be so thankful of where we live and what we're doing, and we have to pay tribute to a lot of these people that were soldiers, not necessarily voluntarily, but they were soldiers. Most of them were drafted. We had a number of them from World War I, and a good number of these are buried in the cemetery in Paradise. But it seems to be a forgotten part of our society, the soldiers and the sacrifices that we all made so that we can all live the way we want to live, and I think we just tend to take that for granted. I think we'd start with World War I with Bill Sanders, and I think I mentioned this at the Heritage Foundation, that Bill was kind of a prospector. It was in World War I he got drafted, and he worked here as day pay once in a while when they were a little short of money. They came down to the ranch and worked on the farm, helped out the family. Well, anyhow, we were out working one February, and it was pretty cold. And I said, Bill, it's sure as heck's cold. And Bill said, let me tell you about cold. And he had been stationed in Siberia for 2 years. And he said 30 or 40 below zero wasn't unusual. Anyhow, he's one of the few old timers that lived in Paradise that when he got senior, went to Douglas and went to the county hospital. And of course, nobody claimed him. So he's buried in Douglas. And of course, he would have been wanted to be in Paradise. Also, there were one of the Lee brothers and Carson Morrow, Dr. Ralph Willie, all World War I guys, and you know most of them are buried in Paradise, and we just want to pay tribute to them. We had a lot of World War II people. One of our foremen for a number of years his name was George Stoner, and George, we talked about the same thing. Dang God, when you're 13, 14, 15 years old, you think it's cold, but you don't realize you haven't really seen life, so you think that's cold. But anyhow, same thing. I said, George, it's cold. And he said, let me tell you about cold. Well, he was stationed up in the Aleutian Islands for 2 years. And again, George, the sacrifice that these guys did was pretty amazing. He still has some, his relatives, one of his sons lives in Rodeo and married to Mary Somoza. Anyhow, he's buried in Paradise as well. We have what we call Fats Alney, who was another old timer that came back wounded. He's buried there. There are just a lot of them, and I missed some of them obviously. Then we had in Korea, we had of course Carl Anderson, who is still here, and he has some great stories about what he did in World War in Korea. He tells about Sergeant Reckless, and I think you have to ask him about Sergeant Reckless because it's a great story from the Marine Corps. We had John Caron. John, the same thing. We went down to John's house one day, and he lived just to the east of us, and we said, geez, John, you got a big fire. It's cold outside. And he said, let me tell you about it. He was up on the Yalu River when the Chinese came in, and I said, how did you survive? And he said, we smoked a lot. And I said, how did you eat? And he said, well, we on the rations, we'd get the little thin cans of fruit and put them under your armpit, and maybe it was slush by the time you got it warm enough, but we got our people out. We also want to pay tribute to Finn Richards, who was our hero. And Finn lived here from the time he was a young man. I don't think he was born here. But he went to school here. There was a school in Portal, or high school. He went for a year or so, and then I think he graduated in San Simon, and of course married Sally Darnell, and ultimately went to school at New Mexico Western. And like a lot of us in college, we joined the National Guard to get a little extra money, but also because we knew we had to complete our military obligation. Well, anyhow, the National Guard got activated, sent to Fort Bliss in El Paso, and they were combined with the New York National Guard, and they ultimately were sent to the Philippines, where he was a member of the Coastal Artillery. Well, of course, the Japanese overtook everything, and he was in the Bataan Death March and survived. he told me many stories, and of course, none of these guys would talk about what happened. And once in a while, in a moment of weakness, they would, they would, I won't say weakness, but they wanted somebody to know, and they didn't tell their wives or their kids necessarily, but some stories that just curl your, I mean, just, it's really kind of sad. But anyhow, he survived and was transported from the Philippines in a tramp steamer, ended up in Japan, and probably weighed 90 or under 100 pounds when he came back. And he was a big 6-foot, 200-pound guy, and just a good neighbor, and always our hero. We also had other people here that from World War II and Korea that you know, just paid a price so that we can live the way we are living today. And I feel pretty strongly about it. My father was born and raised in Austria and educated in Germany, lived through World War I and saw the devastation of World War II, and talked about how fortunate we are that we've never seen the devastation of a war in this country, and people are really quite spoiled about it. He was naturalized, I think, in 1935 or so, and by then, but at that period of time, you had to speak English. You had to do a lot of things that are, people just don't appreciate the level of patriotism that has existed in this country, and we just don't seem to see that today as much as we had. But anyhow, there were a number of people that from World War II. One was Pat Willey, Dr. Ralph Willey's son, and he was a paratrooper as a replacement, and had terrible times in World War II, and never really probably fully recovered from his episodes of what he had to do or what was expected of him. And he got involved in education and always had children and young people in mind when he was doing anything. It was always his priority. Well, we go on to Vietnam, and we have, you know, one of my old friends from 60-something years ago, Eric Hayes, who again was, went from here, and when the parents lost the ranch, they were up in Casa Grande and ultimately in Colorado. He graduated from Colorado State and was going to go into the Naval Air Program. Something happened, and anyhow, he got drafted. And he had a week or so, he was a short timer in Vietnam, took a trip on a helicopter because they needed volunteers. He'd already trained his guys. Well, anyhow, probably, according to him, an errant AK-47 round hit a fuel system. The helicopter caught on fire and crashed. Well, he had terrible injuries, and his parents, I mean, ultimately got evacuated back to the States, and his parents told my parents that the doctors, as he got back into, I believe it was Long Beach, told him that, or told his parents that he'd be lucky to live till he was 35. Anyhow, he was a good friend. He was burned severely, just had a lot of tough times, and he was a tough guy. He still built homes and repaired things and did a lot of things, had a leg amputated. And anyhow, when he was 70 years old, we decided to celebrate that he'd made it twice what he was supposed to. And so we had a double shot of bourbon, of his favorite bourbon, and we did that when he was 70, 71, 72, and 73, and a 74th birthday for some reason, and we didn't do it, and he died within a month or so of his birthday. Anyhow, they're all buried in paradise. There are a lot more of the veterans that were just tough old people. Isaacson and Glenn Isaacson, his son, who had owned the Cave Creek Ranch way back when, and then he ultimately went up to Paradise and bought the jail and the old Paradise jail, and refurbed it, and anyhow the son ended up with it. The son Glenn was drafted in the early 50s, and they sent him to a school to learn how to pack animals, and he was in the Army for 2 or 3 years. When he came back, he was the packer for the Forest Service. They were our heroes. We just thought they were the coolest guys, and he and Jim Strickland, Jill Cavalier is his daughter, they were all part of us. Some of them were a lot younger than us, but they were our heroes. They survived and were buried here. They came back to Portal. One thing, we talk about Finn being our hero, Finn Richards, and he said, no, Eric Hayes is our hero. Eric Hayes survived, and look at what he's had to live through. And so to see the accolades that you get from one veteran to another, it's absolutely amazing. It's it's an honor that we see locally people now honoring the veterans, both here locally, and the San Simon School does a great job of honoring veterans. The FFA provides a meal for them on Veterans Day, and it's just a fun, I won't say fun, but yeah, I guess it is fun to see that there's finally some recognition for the people that have sacrificed so greatly, whether you were in the reserves, whether you're in the active, whether you're in combat, or whatever you did. It was amazing. We had one guy, Ralph Morrow, who was our game ranger for many, many years. His son, Wayne, went to the University of Arizona, of course, grew up here, and his sister was Audrey Miller. And he grew up here. Anyhow, went to the flight trainer, and well, he was a fighter pilot. He flew F-84s or F-86s or a number of airplanes, and always told me he got out too early. He should have stayed in and made a career out of it. But I remember Eric Hayes and I, as youngsters, when Wayne would buzz the local area, buzz Portal, and that was about as exciting as anything could be back in the early 50s. But yeah, he was flying T-33s. I believe that's what he buzzed Portal with. But anyhow, it was kind of fun, and there weren't many people, and they weren't sure what was happening. But it was a fun episode. So we just have to honor our veterans in rodeo and Portal, and just thank them for what they've done. I mean, even if you were in the reserves, you spend a weekend a month plus 15 days a year, so you're spending a lot of time away from family and doing something. Was that for personal gain? Not necessarily. That was because we had the draft, and you had to, as an 18-year-old, had to face up. Were you going to go? Were you going to evade the draft, or were you going to avoid the draft, or were you going to face up and join the actives, or join the reserves, or do something? And that's all gone. Kids just don't understand today the responsibility that you have for living the way we do, and they don't seem to care. They just take everything for granted. Anyhow, part of that is our veterans, and the other thing is we do, I'm presently president of the Paradise Cemetery Association. We put flags up for veterans 3 times a year, on Memorial Day, on 4th of July, and on Veterans Day. And we have people that are helping with that, which is obviously, we obviously are quite thankful for. But anyhow, I think there are 33 or 34 veterans now buried in the Paradise Cemetery. Anyhow, we go on. The other thing that I get kind of concerned about, we had a number of families that lived here that either they didn't have children or they lost children as a young couple. And once they're gone, there's no way of recognizing recognizing what they did in the community, and it's kind of neat when you start thinking about it, the impact it had on me and on Eric Hayes. One was Blackie and Missy Stidham, and Missy was a teacher in Hilltop for a number of years, and Blackie, of course, worked in the mine and had a little ranch of his own, and just helped everybody. And as they had lost their son as a young man, and I kind of think he took me under his wing and tried to help me. And I know when I was getting my 4-H calf, he helped with that. He took me, and they just did a lot of things that we didn't appreciate as a youngster, to thank them for helping us get through some of these tough times. But I know he took us into the fair, and I mean, he just did a lot of things, and didn't realize at that time. Again, when you're 13 or 14, you just don't have the understanding of why people do what they do. And anyhow, he's, again, both he and Missy, neither one are buried here. They're both buried in Douglas, because as they had no children, they ended up going to Douglas for medical or whatever attention, and ultimately are buried in Douglas because nobody really claimed them. Another group was Tom and Nora Stafford, and Tom had been born over in the Stafford cabin in 1880, I believe. Died in 1965, or I believe that's what it was.
Where's the cabin, Ted?
Behind the Faraway Ranch, and that was the original part of the Staffords had the cabin there and sold to Riggs somehow, and that's why the Faraway Ranch is there. But it's just maybe a quarter mile to the north or east of the Faraway Ranch. The cabin's still there. And now Tom told us about his father had a little orchard and a farm, and he would go with his father over to Fort Bowie before he was probably 10, 12 years old, and sold cabbage at $1 or $2 a head, which is a pretty amazing for them. But I mean, they just didn't get any fresh fruit or vegetables, so the officers' wives would pay those prices. But anyhow, he sold out in the early 50s when the prices of ranches were high, and bought Pugsley's place, which is now Bill Mullins in Portal, and he put in trees and did all kinds of things, but quite an interesting guy. Well, they never had any children that I'm aware of, and didn't have much education, but very intelligent people. I mean, they survived. And I know he took me out and I got my first deer with Tom, and we just did a lot of things together because he just enjoyed being with young people. Anyhow, when I was in Portal School, which I graduated from in 1954, he told my parents, well, it's time. Little Teddy had a gun, and of course, my parents said, no, he's way too young. Well, Tom went to town in his Nash Rambler one Friday, bought me a .22 and a whole big box of shells, and presented it to me on Friday afternoon. I didn't know what to say, but I thought it was pretty exciting. So I got to be a pretty good shot because I did a lot of practice. And of course, with Tom, it was just fun. But we'd go hunting. We did a lot of things together. And one of the things, of course, he liked to play dominoes. And I could beat him about half the time, and finally realized that he was cheating sometimes. And so I told my parents, I said, I don't know what to do, and because it isn't fair that he's cheating. And my parents said, just let's let him win. It's okay. It's not gonna hurt anything. And I said, well, it's gonna hurt my feelings. And they said, just live with it. So anyhow, Tom ultimately had cancer, and we going back to the next fellow, which was Pugsley, was our EMT, our doctor locally, and he told us that we need to get Tom to the hospital, and Tom would, since we had one of the few station wagons, we were the ambulance, and we'd haul people all the time to the hospital, and Pugsley would bring them down, and we'd take them.
In the 1960s?
Yeah, late 50s, early 60s. Yeah, Doc Pugsley helped lots and lots of people. He was a CCC doctor. It came here in the early 30s, or the 30s sometimes, whenever the CCC came, because it was a paramilitary organization, the kind of military administration. And in any case, Pug was here, and for some reason or other, he and Anna Rausch got together, and whether she was still married or not, but Anna Rausch owned the house where, as I say, where Bill Mullins was. Her husband was a railroad engineer. I think he was for the El Paso and Southwestern. But anyhow, the CCC camp closed down, and he was sent to the Middle East somewhere, and he told me that the vehicle he was in either got shelled or ran over a landmine, and he was pretty severely injured. So he came back injured. But anyhow, he and Aunt Duck were already married, and he came back here and took care of a lot of people. No children. A lot of stories about him. He's buried in the Reed Cemetery that's presently owned by up in the canyon by the research. Well, not the research, by the research station. Any case, good people. They've done an awful lot, a lot of good for the community, and no children, and nobody really even today knows who he was or what he did. But he had some great stories. During his World War II episode, he lost the sight of one eye, among other things, but he still drove, and he'd come down the canyon in his old Model A, and it was obviously a pretty old vehicle, and he didn't see well. And I know one day Guy Miller was driving up the canyon, saw Pug coming down. He said, I'll just pull over and stop on the side of the road. He did, and Pug ran right straight into him head on. Fortunately, nobody was hurt. They weren't going very rapidly, but anyhow, ultimately both the Pugsleys had an auto accident on the way to Douglas, just this side of the checking station, and that was the end of the Pugsleys. But anyhow, just good people. And
what did they do to make a living here?
I assume that he had some kind of a medical from World War II, and he obviously had some kind of a pension. I'm guessing, just like Eric Hayes had a big one too because of the disability. I'm not sure. They didn't say, but they lived pretty close to the ground. They had a milk cow by the name of Mamie, which was named after Mamie Eisenhower. And they'd sell milk and they'd do this and do that, and people would give him a little money for helping with medical things. I mean, people would call him, and one story we tell is we didn't go to Douglas to get shots necessarily, and sometimes the county would come out and give shots at the school, but he'd give you shots. Well, if you had a cold, he'd give you a penicillin shot. Well, he had these World War II needles or syringes, and the caliber was pretty big. But anyhow, it was always in the butt, and he'd pull down your drawers and whack you in the butt, and you'd have a lump in your butt for a day or two or 3 or 4. So we didn't like to see Pugsley coming too often, because when we came into the house, you could smell they were boiling the instruments, and they put alcohol in the water, and you could smell that for about 2 miles, and we were like quail. When we'd smell that, we were gone. So we had to reschedule it, but that was way Pugsley was. But just good people. And I don't know how many times he came down when we had workers here that had various or in sundry problems, and he'd come down and said, maybe we better get him to the hospital or do this or that. But he just did a lot of things. Unfortunately, there were some people in the community that felt that he shouldn't be practicing without his medical degree or without his medical license, and he had to back off a little bit. But that was also due to old age. But they were just good people. And again, no children, buried up at Ray Mendes's with the Reeds and a few other people. So, those things just seem to disappear when nobody to really care about them, and it goes on. Bert Roberts was another one. Bert, and I can't think of his wife's name, but he was an old rancher. He was related to Sally Richards, and Bert bought what a John Hands had from the Walker brothers, and as he got elderly, he just went into Douglas. His wife had died. He went to Douglas and lived in the Gadsden Hotel, and that's what a lot of the old timers did, and it was pretty convenient. They could get their meals, they could do everything, ride in the elevator, and as they got worse, then they went to the county hospital, which was kind of like a hospice. And again, I think Bert's buried in the Apache cemetery. But we have a number of these people that they're just going to be forgotten. And we all have a lot of stories about all of them because we knew them personally, whether it was Bill Sanders or Epley it's kind of a sad commentary how our society works, that once you're gone, and in 5 years or 10 years, unless you have family, nobody remembers what you did or who you are or what, the good or bad that you did. So anyhow, it's interesting to live where we live, and it was interesting when you've lived in one place for as many years as I have, which is 66 plus years. You've seen a lot of things, a lot of people, and we've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly, and mostly good. I think we're just fortunate to live where we live. We have pretty pleasant weather. Once in a while we have some wind or some rain or something that happens, but for the most part, there are not many places in the country or in the world that have as pleasant of climate as we do. Backing up a little bit to me, I was born in February 1940, so I'm getting to be a little bit older than I was. But we came out here my father bought this place in 1952. And we showed up in June of 1953. Well, at that period of time, Roy Rogers and Gene Autry and all those guys, Hopalong, that was a big deal. And so I was in awe when we showed up here in June of 1953. It was hot, but you're 13 years old, so what? You didn't notice it, and you looked around and got to meet some people, and you got to see things that you couldn't have seen otherwise. As I say, backing up a little bit, my father was born in 1903 and was brought over here in 1901 from Austria, Germany, as he had gotten his PhD I think in July of 1929, was brought over here in 1931 to run a Lighter Than Air Institute in Akron, Ohio. Well, that institute was put together by the Guggenheims, and he had done such a good job on his PhD thesis that Dr. von Karman, his sponsor, suggested that he come over here. Well, anyhow, they brought him over. This is when the age of the dirigibles, and a lot of the German Zeppelin companies and Goodrich had joint partnerships, so they established this Light and Air Institute, which was basically a wind tunnel to do whatever they did. I don't know. Of course, they all fell down and things changed. Well, his area was in axial flow fans, and so when he no longer was in the dirigible business, he started to work for a little company that built fans. Well, anyhow, the coal mining companies came to him and said, "Gee, we need to do something about the ventilation. Can you help us?" And so he designs fans that provided many more, much more air than any of the existing ones that for the power that ran them for a lot less. So it really kind of revolutionized the coal mining industry, because they didn't have to carry their canaries with them to go what they did. Well, anyhow, he was fortunate and got involved in bigger industries and did a lot of things. At the end of World War II, they promoted him or gave him the commission as a major, and he was on Hitler's bunker within weeks after the war because of his technical knowledge of what had happened. Well, I asked him what you did, and he couldn't. He said, "I can't tell you." I asked him, "Well, did you go to Los Alamos?" "I can't tell you." And so I suspect that he was involved in a number of secret things that he just couldn't tell you about. And as knowing the government, when they say don't talk, they mean don't talk, because they have lots of ways of getting even to you. So anyhow, he was concerned because of seeing World War I as his favorite uncle was an artillery officer, and they tethered him up in a balloon 1,000 feet up in the air and wherever they were. And of course, we had the only source of helium, and we didn't sell it to the Germans, so they used hydrogen. And then we learned how to strafe them with incendiary bullets, and that was the end of them. Well, they didn't have parachutes, and that was the end of Uncle Heinrich. My father said, I think it was in 1915 or 16, the only thing he remembered about him was his burned leather jacket. So anyhow, the family lost a lot of brothers. One uncle was lost too. He was gassed, et cetera, et cetera. So anyhow, my father didn't have a very good idea of what could happen in wartime, and he was quite concerned about his family. So I think that's why in 1952 he came out here looking, and he, ever since he came over here in 1931, von Karman was ahead of what is now the aerospace division or department of Caltech, and he said, "You'll have to come out for consultation." And he said, "One of the times, if you don't like it, if you get to see the Grand Canyon, it will be worth the trip over from Europe." Well, anyhow, my dad came out and saw the West, and of course was absolutely amazed. And you think about it, when he was in school, you have pictures of France. I mean, in the atlas or the geography book, a picture of France, a picture of Germany, a picture of Spain, et cetera, and you have a picture of the United States. Well, it's all probably on one page. So he had no concept of the hugeness of this country, and he just fell in love with the West. So whenever he had a chance, when he got married to my mom, or whenever he had time, we were out in the West, in Arizona or New Mexico or Utah or Colorado, and have some pretty fond memories of traveling. But anyhow, one time he was out, and he was on the other side of the mountains, and he went to the Silver Spur Guest Ranch, and that was owned by Ruth and Ray Kent, who had bought it probably in 1946 or 47, and it was the OCCC camp, and they converted it into a guest ranch. And of course now it's the part of the National Monument. They absorbed that, and I think it's just a campground, but it's pretty amazing. But anyhow, he came out and drove up to the gate and said, "Do you have any food?" And the guy said, yeah, if you guys are hungry, we'll fix you something. And so he ended up staying there, and he stayed there 2 or 3 times. And I think the second or third time he said, "Ray," if it was apparently pretty relaxing for him, and of course it was in the time of year that was pretty pleasant in Arizona and not so pleasant in Ohio. And he said, "Ray, if I could find a place like this, I think I'd move out here." And Ray took him up on it. And next time he came over, he said, "I think I have just the place for you." And got into their station wagon, and over the mountain they came and came to the AVA ranch, and he almost bought it on the spot. and he just fell in love with it. And of course, at that time there were a lot of apple trees, and it doesn't look the same as it did, where there are a lot more buildings. But anyhow, so that was in the fall of 1952, and we ended up selling everything in Ohio and moving out here in 1953. Quite an adjustment, you know. My older sister and younger sister and younger brother, they all thought it was the greatest thing alive, except my older sister was a senior in high school and didn't get to finish her school in in Akron, Ohio, and still regrets it. She ended up having to go to a year in Douglas and never, you know, it's pretty tough when you're a senior in high school to adjust to a completely different environment. But anyhow, she did fine and went on to the University of Arizona with a major in plant pathology and lives now in El Paso. She'd also gotten a master's in hospital administration, but now she's gotten a little older. And the younger sister, everybody's, you know, we just adjusted to a different way of life, and it was tough on my mom, I suspect, because she was used to the green, and her family had been there since probably in Ohio since the 1820s or 1830s. They had come from Bavaria, and they were farmers, and her father had graduated from Ohio State in 1902 with a law degree. So he was a lawyer and quite involved in a lot of things. Anyhow, we ended up out here, and it was a very, very different world. And I think we adjusted, and I don't know what would happen if we would have stayed where we were. But as we progress on the ranch, we always had a big interest in agriculture. My little sister had sheep in the 4-H, and little brother, and they won all kinds of ribbons in the county and the state fairs, and we all went on to, you know, to Portal, to Douglas. And we boarded in Douglas I boarded for 4 years. I could keep my 4-H or FFA calves there, and it worked out pretty well. And then on to the University of Arizona. It's just a different world, and we've adjusted to it. Everybody liked the ranch, but it wouldn't provide an income for everybody, so everybody kind of went their own way. Parents stayed here for many years, and my mother passed on in 1977. Dad stayed here for a number of years and then felt that he wanted to go to Tucson. So he moved to Tucson probably about 1980 or so. And then he passed away in 2000 at 97 plus. Anyhow, we've had a good life. He left a nice trust fund, which the family gives periodically to needy and charitable organizations. And it's a good life. And, you know, of course, then I've got children and grandchildren, and they all love the ranch, but it's getting to be more and more difficult to hold on to it. The taxes are high, the maintenance is high, finding people to do the kind of work that we're used to doing, to have it in the kind of pristine condition, and you just can't do everything. And as I say, as I get older, I can't do everything. We think we can, but we just can't do it. And so we've been looking at maybe doing selling some of the conservation easements, see whether we can do with that, or just dispersing the whole thing. And as I mentioned at the Heritage Foundation, we've had a lot of buyers that would look at it. Of course, everybody wants it for free, but one of them was one of the Beatles. And as I say, I don't know if we would have sold it to him, what Portal would look like today. But on the other hand, I start looking at it, maybe it might have been a good idea to sell back then, and it wouldn't have the issues. But anyhow, we have a lot of, the ranch has not sold anything off of it. Contrary to all the people around us have sold many, many pieces, and that's how Portal has changed. Unfortunately, our taxes are getting to be such that, in taxes and insurance, it's getting to be brutal. How long can we absorb it? I don't know. Well, we do feel pretty proud that we managed to preserve the AVA for 66 plus years. If we wouldn't have, I'm not sure what anything would look like today, but we felt that that was just an obligation we had to the land. And we look back to the thousands of years that the Indians had been in this area, and finding metates and finding the various ways that they stayed alive. And obviously we've had many climate changes. We've had many changes over the years, and they didn't survive. We have, and we think by being 66 years, that's a great deal. But you know, we know that those Indians were here thousands of years ago, and how long they stayed, we don't know. But at least we managed to preserve a little bit of it for a little while.
I wanted to know, Ted, when you were talking about some of the old timers here, you said a number of times these were my heroes, and I wanted to know a little bit more about what you meant by that.
Well, in retrospect, we look at people like Finn Richards or Eric Hayes that went through, or John Karen, or some of these people that just went through terrible times. Bill Sanders, that you can't fathom what they lived through. And if they lived through something that we weren't used to, we just looked up to them. We thought they were our heroes, or we looked at them as heroes. And of course, my father and my parents said that they had done something above and beyond the call of duty, both in a military sense and for the community. They all helped the community. They understood how tough things could be in other places, and they just did what they could to help a lot of people. And of course, we looked up to all of them, and I mean, there were just many of them that were like that. One of them was Smitty down, Sir Herbert Smith, that lived down in the valley, and he was an Englishman, and they just always seemed to, well, I suspect there was more of a community. We'd have school functions, and everybody'd go to the school, and if you were graduating, they all bought you a present. If it was a Halloween party or a Christmas party, it was just a sense of community, which is probably not the same today, because all these people had lived here for many, many years, and they understood how tough it was to make a living in the desert, or how tough it was to make a living on a farm or ranch. And so they I think, wanted to help the younger folks out by doing various things that we didn't think much of them at the time, but as you grow older, you recognize that they had really kind of sacrificed to help us along, and in many cases they had no children, and I suspect maybe that was something they missed, or they, if they lost children, it's just something I can't understand, because I never lost a child. But it's got to be a tough physically and mentally and emotionally to get through those things. And well, I think part of that's the community. I think part of it's the length of time that people have lived, that you become part of the community. I think it's a different age. We talk about it today. When we were youngsters, if you didn't have the cash to buy something, you didn't buy it. Today, kids just use a credit card. They don't even think about that it costs anything. If they want it, they get it. And there's no sacrifice, no level of help, we just don't have a sense of community that we had many years ago. And of course, rural communities, you had to help your neighbors because you couldn't do it all on your own. And there was always something, whether it was hauling them to the doctor, hauling them to the hospital, getting groceries for them. When you went to town, you just did a lot of things for your neighbors that you see today barely, but nothing like it used to be. But again, 95% of the people here at that time, 50 years ago, were making a living here, and a few were having an income coming in from something else. Today, it's switched around. There's probably 5% of the people that make a living, and so people have come from somewhere else and just take everything for granted, good or bad. That's just the way it is, and you adjust to the difference. And we see, as an example, the So What Club was initially established by the county agents and the University of Arizona to help women learn how to sew better, to can, to do a lot of things. And today that doesn't happen. It's more of a political organization rather than a self-help or a help organization. And of course, the kids went, and it was very family-oriented. And today, we just don't see many children around Portal. When I graduated from Portal School, there were 20+ kids in the Portal School, plus at least 8 or 10 more going to high school, whether it was Animas or Douglas or Bisbee somewhere, but they were, or Sansimo, and they were going to high school. So it's just changed. We see an elderly population with no children, and who does show up are the grandkids, and they're here for 2 days or 2 weeks, and isn't it fun? And then they go home. And we did a lot of things. One of them was, we had movies on Friday night. We'd go to rodeo, and they had these old movies, and rodeo. There was a guy by the name of Ray Eddington that had the electrical contract for rodeo, or the franchise contract, and he had an old generator next to where Bill and Nancy Klute's store is, and so the lights were always kind of flickering. But anyhow, we get to go down for Friday night movies, and it was pretty exciting. If the film broke, that was the end of it. If the light bulb blew out, that was the end of it, or whatever. But that went on for many years until probably the late 50s, early 60s, when when television came into being, and that changed the country. The other thing is they used to have dances every Saturday night. I mean, at least in the warmer parts of the year. Portal had the concrete pad, which is called Laverne's Pavilion. Laverne Alney, who was the postmistress, and her husband was Fats, and she was a page. She grew up in Whitetail, but anyhow, the school budget was pretty limited, and so she came up with the idea, let's have some dances. And so we poured that concrete. It took us a couple of weeks to pour that concrete pad, and we had many dances there, and it was a lot of fun.
Where is that, Ted?
By the post office.
Right there.
That concrete pad
Yeah.
right now.
And that's the origin of that.
Yeah, and that's called Laverne's Pavilion. So anyhow, they'd had dances, whether it was there or whether it was up at Maloney's or whether it was in Paradise or whether it was in, had a lot of them in Animas and Hachita, and so usually Saturday night, the whole family went, and that was the entertainment. That's how people got together. It wasn't always, everybody didn't get along. There was some drinking and fighting, and you'd go to one dance and you're supposed to wear your hat, and the next place you don't wear your hat, and if you got in the wrong spot, you got reminded that you don't wear your hat, or you do wear your hat, but those were not too serious things that you got involved with. But it was fun. I mean, Sally Richards was our teacher for a little while, and she was the best teacher. And when I was in grade school, of course, my brothers and sisters had Sally, and I know my little sister was Eric was the only one in his class, and she was the only one in her class. So Sally said, let's promote Chris because she's pretty smart, and so we had two of them in there. So she got to get ahead a little bit. But Sally was, she was just a great person, great kid, and then they had their own children, and it was just a different world then. But it is what it is, and it doesn't make any difference where you live in the world. Nothing stays the same. And one thing we learned as youngsters is the only thing that stays stable is change, and change is inevitable. And we think back when we barely had electricity here. I mean, we had generators, and when you got REA, that was pretty exciting to have electricity. And then we had an old crank phone, and the old crank phone was set up by the Forest Service, and when they decided they don't need it anymore in the early 60s, then the Valley Telephone Co-op took over, and we had real telephones. Started out with 8 party lines and ultimately got along. But that was another one. The Elmer and Mamie Franklin, he grew up in Paradise, and Mamie grew up as a Pattison, grew up over by Apache, and she was a telephone operator for many years. They had no children, and they ultimately moved to Sandsville. They're both buried in Paradise, but no children, and just good old folks. Elmer's father, George, homesteaded up in Paradise and had the ranch that includes most of Silver Creek. And when they sold out in the early 50s to Bill Cambridge, then they worked as a telephone operator for a while, and he did a little bit of day work, and that was that. But we just have had a lot of people, and as you think back about it and we talk about it, you forgotten about a lot of these people, but they're, most of them are buried in Paradise, and we try to have a cleanup and honor them somehow. But it's getting to be a lot of people and a lot of cremations. It used to be we'd dig a grave, or we didn't do it. Bill Sanders and Ed Epley would blast, and us kids would shovel it out. And I don't think any of them got to be 6 feet deep, but it was solid rock. I know it was fun, but that's one of the things you did. Mm-hmm. Another one, back to the old stories, when I was kind of a skinny little 100-pound kid, and Blackie was kind of the maintenance guy of the telephone. It was all volunteer, and I think you paid a little fee, but there wasn't much money for the telephone association with our old crank system. And so on a Saturday, Blackie'd come and get me and said, come and get me, and say, well, we need to go look at something on the telephone. I said, fine, Blackie. And So I'd go up with him, and he said, "Oh, we better look at that pole." And I got elected, and he had climbers, and you climb up and check the insulators, and some of the poles had already rotted off at the ground, but the wires held them up, and that was an experience. But between Blackie and I, we kept the phone system going for a while, and those are just things that you did as a kid, and I mean, it was just a given. You didn't get paid for it. You didn't get anything. And that reminds me of another story that Tom and Nora Stafford were they were old farm ranch people, and budgets were tight. They just didn't spend money, and they were not in the habit of spending money. And you've got to understand, in this day and age, if you live on a farm or a ranch, you only get paid once or twice a year. You don't know what you're going to get for your cattle or for your hay or your cotton. Well, hay is a little different, but for cotton or whatever, because you only get it once a year. So you really watch your cost. You don't spend money because you don't know if you're going to get it recovered. And most people today get a paycheck every week or every 2 weeks or twice a month or something to that effect. So they said, well, if I can't get it this week, I'll pay for it the next week and I'll charge it or whatever. But anyhow, they were tight with their money. And you can't blame them because they were tough times in the desert. Well, anyhow, Nora, one day when I think I was still in Portal School, Nora said, you want to come and work for me for Saturday morning? I got some things to do. And I said, well, why not? And I was thinking, she said, I pay real good. And I said, I was thinking, I'm going to get $1 an hour for $2 or $3. And back then, that was a pretty good chunk of change for us. And so Nora said, yeah, I said, okay, I'll be over there. And so I showed up at 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock, whatever time it was supposed to be. And I said, what is it, Nora? And she said, on the south side of the house, again, where Bill Mullins lives, there were a series, probably a 6 or 8 Hollywood or whatever kind of doors, but they had a whole bunch of windows in them, and I think each door had 10 or 12 windows, and there were 6 or 8 of them. So I thought, well, I'll get a bottle of Windex and some paper towels, and that'll be a slick deal because I can do both sides. Well, guess what? I got a bowl of water with not Clorox, but vinegar in it, and some newspapers, and I go, oh no. Well, anyhow, I did a great job, and about 3 hours later I had it all cleaned as a whistle, and it was about noon. And I said, Nora, I'm all done. What do you want me to do with the old paper and stuff? I said, I'll take care of it. And she said, well, just a minute, let me go get your pay. And I was thinking, boy, maybe I'm going to get $3 or $2.50 for this. And so she comes out with a lemon meringue pie already cut in 6 pieces. And she said, here you are. And I go, holy moly, I didn't know if I knew any cuss words at that time, but I said, okay. So I walked home, which is about, half a mile or so, and got home at about lunchtime. And of course, my brothers and sisters, there were 6 of us all together. I got 1 piece of pie. And I, you didn't know exactly how to what to do about it. But anyhow, Nora called me the next week and said, little Teddy, you did such a good job. Can you come and help me? I'll pay you real good. And I said, Nora, I'm really busy. I don't think I can make it. Anyhow, we had stories, and that was part of growing up. Another part of growing up was we had our 4-H calves, and when we went to the fair, they blocked off G Avenue in front of the Gadsden Hotel and had a little show ring there, and you brought your calf out, and everybody bid on it. And the market then was maybe 15 or 20 cents a pound for a steer calf, and so I showed mine, and I think I got 67 cents a pound times 700 pounds. It was a pretty good chunk of change for a kid, until I realized that my good buddy Eric Hayes got 90 cents a pound. I said, well, what happened? And almost identical calves. And one of my neighbors said, well, don't you realize his grandfather Greenemeyer just bid it up? And I said, this isn't fair, but that's part of life. That's one of the lessons. So you learn these lessons at 12 or 13 or 14, and I don't think you ever forget them, but that's just part of life. And you look at the rewards, and you think about how many kids have lived in the city, never could experience those kinds of things. And you raise a little steer calf for 6-8 months, and then that he's going to that's the end of him, and you kind of get attached to these guys, and that's the way it is. But that's something you learn on the farm. You see things born, see things died, and most people don't have that kind of experience in life until many years later. And I don't know if it's good or bad, but it's the way it is. I think you become a little bit adjusted to how tough or how good things can be, or maybe appreciate the good things more, and learn how to deal with the tough things. So anyhow, it was fun growing up. It was fun doing the things that we did. We had a lot of experiences that are just kind of humorous. My sister had sheep, and we'd block the sheep. And I know bad weather, she'd bring them in the house, and we had to block them. And she did very well with her sheep. And
Ted, I don't know what blocking is.
well, blocking is when they have a lot of wool, and the judges want them to look all perfect. So you cut them with a shears so that they look square or whatever they did at the time. That's probably different today than it was then, but you had a little table you put them on, and it was kind of fun. One time it was a cold winter, and we have a fish pond just to the south of the house, and I can't remember who was concerned about it, but we were afraid it's going to be so cold that the fish wouldn't survive, and they're pretty good sized goldfish. So we didn't. Nobody knew what the heck to do, so we collected the fish, and they stayed in the bathtub for a couple of weeks. And we had one of those old bathtubs with feet on it, and I don't know how we managed, but we did somehow. So then the fish went back when it warmed up a little bit. Well, we just had fun experiences. We played, and the people that in my age group can appreciate it. We played kick the can, and we played all kinds of games that I don't think kids do today, but they did then. And of course, that reminds me, back in the summer of 1957, David Rockefeller had acquired the research station from the Healds, and of course Philip and Phyllis and I can't remember what his name was. They were quite authors, and they probably coined the idea of the name the Sky Island, Weldon Heald, and Phyllis coined the name Sky Island. Any case, they had bought out, I think, in 1955, and so David Rockefeller sent his daughter out here in the summer of 1957, and she was something. Of course, you know, if you're a Rockefeller, what do you expect? And she came many times to the. Parents would have hot dog, hamburger things for the few kids that were left around here, and I can't think of what her name is just offhand, but she. My mom thought, boy, that would be a great match for me, who was probably 16 or 17 at the time, and I was about as shy could be, and it's all I could do to talk to her. But anyhow, my mom said, you know, she was the only one that came and offered to help with the dishes after the party was over, and so she said she's got to be okay.